Thomas came home from war with no family waiting, no house to return to, and only a little savings left. His youth had passed between duty, distance, and all the things he never got to say to his father. And the small train depot where they once sat together was about to be sold and forgotten. Then, on a quiet walk back into town, a torn flyer blew across his boots. He picked it up and read, "Abandoned train depot for sale." In that moment, every memory came rushing back. Why would a tired veteran choose a broken station over a safer new start? Why did his German shepherd, Max, keep watching the old ticket counter? And what had been hidden beneath the floor, waiting for the right man? What Thomas found would change his life and bring a forgotten place back to light. If this story moves you, share where you're watching from, and stay for more stories of loyalty and second chances. The morning air in the West Virginia mountains smelled of wet leaves, coal dust, and distant snow. Low clouds dragged across the ridgelines, and the narrow road into town shone dark with meltwater from last night's light snowfall. It was late winter, the kind that left patches of old snow in the ditches and a thin cold hanging stubbornly in the trees. Thomas came back with one duffel bag, a canvas jacket worn thin at the cuffs, and a German shepherd walking close to his left leg as if the road still needed guarding. He was 46 years old, with broad shoulders, dark brown hair silvering at the temples, and a thin salt and pepper beard along a jaw made harder by years of discipline. His gray-blue eyes looked calm from a distance, but up close they were always measuring doors, windows, passing cars, and sudden movement. People often thought Thomas was quiet because he had little to say. The truth was simpler and heavier. Service had taught him that too many words could fail a man, and grief had taught him that the most important ones were often spoken too late. The dog beside him was Max, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a black saddle across his back, tan legs, amber eyes, and one torn ear that never stood quite as straight as the other. Gray had begun to show around his muzzle, giving him the solemn look of a creature that had seen too much human trouble and decided to stay loyal anyway. Max had come to Thomas after the war through a veterans support program, but Thomas never liked calling him support. Max was not a service. Max was a witness. He had pulled Thomas out of nightmares, out of crowds, and out of silent rooms where the walls seemed to lean too close. The bus let them off near the edge of Harper's Bend, beside a faded town sign with peeling white paint. The driver, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with a gray mustache and weather-reddened cheeks, opened the luggage compartment himself and handed Thomas the duffel. He had the practical kindness of someone who did not ask questions unless the answer might actually help. "Good dog," the driver said. Max glanced at him once, accepted the compliment with grave dignity, and turned back toward Thomas. The driver gave a small laugh. "He knows it, doesn't he?" Thomas almost smiled. "He's been told." The bus pulled away, leaving them beside the road with the mountains rising behind the town like old witnesses. Harper's Bend had not changed as much as Thomas expected, and somehow that made it harder. The diner still sat near the four-way stop, with red vinyl booths visible through fogged windows. The hardware store still had shovels, feed buckets, and yellow work gloves stacked near the door. The old church steeple still leaned slightly east, as if listening for a bell that no longer rang on time. But the town had thinned. A few storefronts were dark. Plywood covered the windows of the old movie theater. Dirty snow clung to the edges of the sidewalks, and the laundromat where his mother once folded sheets on Saturday mornings had become a thrift store crowded with mismatched lamps and winter coats. Everything was familiar, but shifted, like a photograph left too long in the cold. Thomas stood at the edge of the sidewalk, gripping the strap of his duffel. He had imagined coming home many times. In those imaginings, returning always meant arriving somewhere. In truth, it felt more like stepping into a room after everyone else had gone. His mother, Ruth, had been gone since he was 19. She had been a small, bright woman with sun-browned skin, black hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and a laugh that could fill their kitchen even when the cupboards were nearly bare. Thomas had lost her before he understood that a home was not the walls around a family, but the voices that made those walls feel safe. His father, Daniel, had lived longer. He was tall, lean, and sharp-boned, with gray hair combed back, a short beard, and hands shaped by railwork, carpentry, and stubbornness. Daniel was not an easy man, but he was steady. He showed love through repaired steps, packed sandwiches, checked tires, and quiet rides to the station on Saturday afternoons. When Thomas left for the military, Daniel had already begun to weaken. The cough was there, the slower walk was there, the way he sat down before taking off his boots, as if standing had become a negotiation, was there too. Thomas noticed it all and still went, because Daniel had looked him in the eye and said, "If you've got strength left in you, use it for something bigger than yourself." At the time, Thomas heard pride in those words. Years later, in barracks, hospital corridors, and the blue hours before sunrise, he began to hear the loneliness beneath them. Daniel died while Thomas was still overseas. There had been leave, a funeral, and many kind people telling him his father had understood. Thomas thanked them because he knew they meant well. Then he went back to his unit carrying the things he had never said. Now, walking into Harper's Bend with Max at his side, Thomas felt the weight of every mile he had placed between himself and the man who once sat beside him at the old depot, sharing paper-wrapped sandwiches while coal trains thundered past. He had come home with a small amount of savings, not enough for comfort, only enough for careful choices. He had no family waiting on a porch, no bedroom kept ready, no key under a stone. His father's old house had been sold after medical bills and taxes swallowed what little remained. There were only streets he remembered and buildings that seemed surprised to see him older. Max pressed his shoulder against Thomas's leg. Thomas looked down. "I know," he said softly. "I'm walking." Max gave a quiet huff, as if forgiving him for stating the obvious. They passed the diner without going in. A woman wiping the front window looked up and watched them. She was in her early 60s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with silver hair twisted into a knot, and a face lined by long work rather than age alone. Thomas did not know her, or perhaps he had once known her when names came easier. She lifted 2 fingers in a small wave. Thomas returned it because Daniel had raised him not to ignore a greeting in a small town. Instead of turning toward Main Street, Thomas followed the old road beyond the last row of houses, where the pavement narrowed and winter weeds pushed through the ditch line beside patches of old snow. It was not the fastest way into town, but his feet chose it before his mind admitted why. The road led toward the old rail bed. The tracks had been gone for years. Thomas remembered reading about it in one of Daniel's letters, written in his careful block handwriting. They pulled the last of the track past the depot. "Looks naked now. Your mother would have said it needs a coat." Thomas had kept that letter longer than most, not because it said anything important, but because it sounded like home trying not to sound sad. The closer he came to the station, the slower he walked. The Harper's Bend depot stood beyond a line of bare sycamores, half hidden by brush and a leaning chain-link fence. It was smaller than memory had made it, though memory had a way of making childhood places taller. The building was 1 story, long and narrow, with weathered clapboard siding beneath peeling cream paint. The roof sagged slightly over the freight room end, holding a thin, uneven dusting of old snow in the colder shade. Several windows were boarded from the inside. The platform boards had warped and silvered with age, and tufts of dry grass pushed through the edges where the snow had already begun to melt. Above the bay window where the ticket agent had once watched for incoming trains, a faded green sign still hung crooked. Its white letters barely readable, Harper's Bend Depot. Thomas stopped at the edge of the platform. For a moment, he was 9 years old again, sitting beside Daniel with his legs too short to reach the ground, holding half a sandwich while his father explained that timing mattered. A train could not simply arrive when it pleased. Men depended on schedules. Families depended on men. Time, Daniel had said, was not just something a clock kept. It was something a person owed. Thomas had laughed back then because a boy could not understand the sorrow hidden inside good advice. He remembered asking if trains ever got tired. Daniel had pretended to think hard, then said, "Only the ones that forget where they're going." Now Thomas looked at the boarded windows and felt those words settle beneath his ribs. Max climbed onto the first step of the platform and sniffed the air. He did not pull ahead the way he usually did when exploring a new place. He stood still, nose lifted, ears angled forward, body quiet. Then he looked back at Thomas. "What?" Thomas asked. Max did not bark. He simply sat down. The gesture struck Thomas harder than it should have. Max could be dramatic about dinner, suspicious of umbrellas, and deeply offended by squirrels that refused proper discipline, but he did not sit in unfamiliar places without reason. He sat now as if the depot had given an order, and he had accepted it. Thomas stepped onto the platform. The boards complained beneath his boots, but held. Rainwater and melting snow dripped from a broken gutter into an old metal bucket someone had left years ago. The sound was small and steady, like a clock measuring what the town had forgotten. A few light flakes began to drift through the gray air, not enough to cover anything, only enough to remind him that winter had not fully let go. He looked through a gap between the boards covering the waiting room window. Inside, he could see shadows, a bench along the far wall, the shape of a pot-bellied stove, and dust floating in a pale shaft of light. It should have looked dead. Instead, it looked paused. A weather-clouded notice had been nailed to the front door beneath a plastic sleeve. Thomas wiped it with his sleeve and read it twice. The property was scheduled for county sale. The building was considered unsafe. Interested buyers could contact the municipal office before final disposition. Final disposition. Thomas stared at those words for a long time. He thought of letters answered too briefly, calls postponed, visits he believed there would always be time for. He thought of the years he had spent serving something larger than himself, and how strange it felt now to wonder whether duty could also mean returning to something small before it disappeared. Max leaned against his leg again. Thomas looked down at him. "Don't start." Max gave a quiet sneeze, which somehow sounded like disagreement. Across the road, wind moved through the dry weeds along the old rail bed. No train came. No whistle called. Yet Thomas felt, with a certainty he could not explain, that the place had not finished waiting. He touched the old doorframe, careful not to press too hard against the rotting wood. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. Max stayed seated beside him. The clouds shifted, and a weak line of sunlight touched the old depot roof. For one brief second, the peeling paint looked almost warm. Thomas picked up his duffel bag. "Come on, Max," he said. "Let's find out who still has the key." Max rose at once, tail low but moving, and followed him down the platform steps toward town. Behind them, the old depot stood silent in the mountain air, boarded, weathered, and waiting. Not yet saved, not yet lost. And for the first time since coming home, Thomas was not only walking away from the past, he was walking toward something. The municipal office sat behind the hardware store, a low brick building with fogged windows, a snow-dusted ramp, and an American flag hanging tired in the late winter mist. Thomas stood under the awning for a moment before going in, not because he was afraid of offices, but because he understood that some doors changed a life more quietly than battlefields did. Max waited beside his left leg, damp from the cold mist, his amber eyes fixed on the door as though whatever waited inside had already been judged and tolerated. The front room smelled of paper, coffee, floor polish, and old radiator heat. Behind the counter sat a woman in her late 50s, short and sturdy, with pale skin, iron gray hair cut in a neat bob, and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her nameplate read, Martha Willis, municipal clerk. She had the sharp-eyed patience of someone who had spent too many years translating people's hopes into forms, fees, and warnings. Martha looked at Max first, then at Thomas's duffel bag. If he bites, he waits outside. He only bites when someone makes a strong argument for it, Thomas said. For half a second, Martha looked unimpressed. Then the corner of her mouth moved. "What can I do for you?" "The old depot," Thomas said. "Harper's Bend Depot. I saw the notice." That changed the room, not loudly, just enough for Martha's hands to pause over the stack of envelopes. She looked at Thomas more carefully now, taking in the worn canvas jacket, the soldier-still posture, the dog sitting like a shadow with a heartbeat. Name? Thomas Walker. Her expression softened around the edges. Daniel Walker's son. It was not a question. Thomas felt the words settle against him with unexpected weight. "Yes, ma'am." Martha pulled a brown file from a cabinet behind her. "Your father fixed the back steps on this building after the flood of '98. Wouldn't take payment. Said the town had already paid him in bad coffee and potholes. She laid the file on the counter. He was a stubborn man. Thomas looked at the file instead of her face. He could be. Usually when it mattered. She opened the folder. The depot had passed into county ownership years after the railway abandoned the parcel. For a while, committees had discussed preserving it. Then budgets tightened, people moved away, and memory became another thing no one knew how to pay for. The building had sat through storms, vandals, freeze-thaw cracks, and years of postponed decisions. Now the county wanted it off the books. The price was $1,200, as is. No utilities, no safety guarantee, buyer responsible for repairs, permits, inspections, insurance, and every bad surprise an old building might still be hiding. Martha slid a photograph across the counter. The depot looked worse in the picture than it had in Thomas's memory. The roofline sagged over the freight room end. The clapboard siding had peeled down to gray wood. Dark stains ran beneath the eaves. The boarded windows made the place look less dead than wounded. "You understand?" Martha said. "Buying it doesn't mean you can use it for business." "I understand. You would need inspection before public use, electrical work, food permits if you serve meals, liability coverage, roof repairs before anything else. Maybe floor work, maybe foundation work." Thomas nodded. "I am not trying to scare you. You are doing a fair job anyway." "Good," Martha said. "Fear is cheaper than regret." Thomas touched the envelope inside his jacket. $1,500. That was all he had left after bus fare. Cheap rooms on the way home, medicine, food for Max, and 2 small debts he had refused to drag behind him. It was not enough to call savings with a straight face, but it was enough for one careful beginning. Until that morning, he had known what that beginning would be. He had planned to rent a narrow corner on Main Street and open a breakfast counter, nothing proud, 2 coffee urns, a used griddle, a few stools if he could find them cheap. Eggs, toast, biscuits, soup, and coffee, strong enough for men and women who started work before daylight. Retired miners, truck drivers, road crews, shift workers with cracked hands and quiet faces. Thomas understood that kind of person. He knew what a warm cup could mean when the world expected a man to keep moving. That plan had been modest, useful, almost sensible. The depot was none of those things. It was risk wearing a roof. It was grief with a legal description. It was a building that could take nearly everything he had and give him nothing but leaks, splinters, and another reason to look foolish in front of a town that remembered his father better than it knew him. But if he walked away, the next step was easy to imagine. Another thaw, another storm, then a demolition crew. Orange cones, crowbars, the bay window broken out, the platform ripped up, the faded sign tossed into a truck bed. A place where Daniel once sat with him on Saturday afternoons would become scrap before Thomas had even decided what home meant now. Martha watched him quietly. She had the decency not to rush a man while he measured the cost of his own heart. Max sat beside Thomas's boot, still and patient. Martha lowered her voice. "Your father used to bring you there, Saturday afternoons? I remember. You were all elbows and questions. Daniel sat on that platform like the train still owed him punctuality." She glanced at the photograph. He made old things feel useful. Thomas kept his eyes on the depot's crooked sign. He believed in keeping things working. "No," Martha said gently. "He believed in promises. Work was how he kept them." The sentence moved through Thomas like a match struck in a dark room. He could almost hear Daniel's voice. A man should know the difference between a calling and a bad purchase. The trouble was, Thomas could no longer tell which one stood in front of him. Maybe both. Maybe most worthwhile things began that way. He placed the envelope on the counter. "I have $1,200. Martha did not touch it at first. "Thomas, if that is all you have, you walk out of here with $300. I know. That will not restore a depot. No. It may not get you through the month. I know that too. Then tell me this is more than a memory." Thomas took a slow breath. Outside, a truck passed through slush, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. "I plan to open a breakfast counter," he said. "I still do, if the building lets me. Coffee, soup, simple food, a warm place for people passing through, people working early, People who don't have anywhere to sit without buying more than they can afford. He paused. I know I might fail, but if I let that depot go, I think I lose the last road back to my father. And maybe the first road forward for myself. Martha looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the envelope. The paperwork took nearly an hour. Thomas signed where she pointed, initialed where she tapped, and listened while she repeated every hard truth. The sale was final. The town was not responsible for injury, repairs, theft, weather damage, animals, trespassers, or poor judgment. Martha did not smile when she said that last part, but she did look at him long enough for Thomas to understand it had been added especially for men like him. At the end, she gave him a receipt, a temporary deed transfer, and an old brass key on a ring with a paper tag that read, Depot Front in faded ink. The key felt heavier than $1,200. Martha came around the counter and took a small dog biscuit from a jar near the printer. Max accepted it with careful manners. Keep him off wet roofs, she told Max. Men who think they're steady are usually the first ones to fall. Max chewed as if he had received official orders. Thomas tucked the papers inside his jacket. Thank you. Martha nodded toward the key. Daniel would have called you foolish. I know. Then he would have shown up with a ladder. That stayed with him all the way to Pritchard Hardware. The store was warm and close, smelling of sawdust, rubber boots, kerosene, and machine oil. Behind the counter stood Earl Pritchard, a broad, square-faced man in his early 60s, with thick forearms, a close white beard, and a dark green flannel shirt under a brown work vest. Earl had the suspicious patience of a man who trusted tools more than speeches, but his eyes were not unkind. He watched Thomas move through the aisles, picking up items, putting them back, counting silently. You fixing something? Earl asked, or apologizing to it. Thomas held up a tarp. Maybe both. Earl's eyes dropped to the brass key in Thomas's hand. Depot. Thomas nodded. Bad roof, bad floor, worse timing. That has been mentioned. Earl came around the counter without asking. He replaced Thomas's thin tarp with a heavier one, pulled 2 small boxes of nails from a lower shelf, chose a used hammer from a trade-in bin, added weatherproof tape, a cheap flashlight, stove polish, lamp oil, 2 cans of beans, a loaf of bread, and a small bag of dry food for Max. Thomas added the cheapest notebook he could find. The total came to $87.40. Thomas knew it should have been higher. Earl's face made it clear that mentioning it would be a mistake, so Thomas only said, My father bought nails here. Your father argued about nails here, Earl said. Different thing. He once fixed my loading dock in January with one good hand and a temper mean enough to heat the alley. Told me I could pay him by not talking while he worked. That sounds like him. It was a peaceful afternoon. Earl tucked the receipt into the bag. Don't climb wet boards alone. I'll be careful. Careful still falls. Be smarter than careful. Thomas accepted the bags. I'll try. Try with both feet on the ground. By late afternoon, Thomas and Max were back at the depot. The old brass key resisted at first, as if the lock needed time to remember it still belonged to a door. Thomas worked it gently until something inside gave a rusty click. The front door opened with a long wooden sigh, and the waiting room breathed cold dust into the evening. Inside, the air smelled of damp boards, old soot, mouse nests, and years without footsteps. The room was long and narrow, with a worn bench along one wall, the pot-bellied stove in the corner, and the ticket window set beneath the bay. The floor looked safest near the center. The corners were darker, swollen by old leaks. Snowmelt ticked from somewhere overhead into a shallow puddle near the wall. Max entered first, nose low, ears forward. He walked the perimeter, paused near the stove, the bench, and the ticket counter, then returned to Thomas with the grave expression of an inspector bringing bad news. Understood, Thomas said. He began where the building was losing fastest. He set the tarp under the worst leak until daylight would let him see the roof. He taped plastic over a cracked pane. He swept a space near the bench. He cleared soot and old nesting from the stove as best he could, then stacked dry scraps of wood he found in the freight room. It was not repair. It was triage. The stove took nearly an hour to trust him. Smoke came first, then a reluctant orange glow, then a small fire that held. Thomas crouched before it, hands black with soot, shoulders aching, and watched the flame gather itself like an old heart remembering its work. By flashlight, he opened the notebook and wrote on the first page, "Depot purchase, $1,200. Supplies, $87.40. Remaining, $212.60. Do not waste." The final number sat on the page like a dare. Fear was there. He did not deny it. Fear lived in the draft, the leaking roof, the weak fire, the unknown repairs inside the walls. But beneath it was something steadier. For years, every place he slept had belonged to someone else. Barracks, tents, buses, motel rooms, borrowed couches, temporary corners of a life always passing through. This room was cold. It might humble him. It might ruin him. But it was a place he had chosen. Later, when the stove had warmed the room just enough to keep the cold from winning, Thomas unrolled his thin blanket on the bench. Max settled on the floor below and rested his head against Thomas's boot. Outside, wind moved along the old rail bed, pushing loose snow against the platform steps. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse scratched with the confidence of a creature who believed ownership was still under review. Thomas looked toward the dark ticket window. "This is a terrible idea," he said. Max gave a tired sigh, which was not disagreement. For the first time in years, Thomas did not feel like he was waiting for permission to stay. The depot was not a home yet. It was not even safe enough to deserve the word. But that night, under a leaking roof in a forgotten station, with $212.60 left to his name, and a faithful dog breathing beside him, Thomas made the first decision of his new life. He would not run from this place. He would rebuild it, one careful dollar at a time. By morning, the depot had stopped feeling like a brave decision and started looking like a bill Thomas could not yet pay. The weak fire had gone gray in the stove. Meltwater ticked somewhere above the freight room wall. Cold moved through the floorboards with the confidence of something that had lived there longer than he had. Thomas stood in the waiting room with his jacket buttoned to his throat, a pencil in one hand and the cheap notebook in the other. Max sat near the stove, watching him with the solemn patience of a dog who knew the day would be long before the man did. Thomas wrote the first list beneath the numbers from the night before. Roof over freight room, soft floor near ticket booth, broken window by bench, stovepipe, old well, dead electrical panel, door hinges, unknown problems. He stared at the last line for a while. It was the most honest one. The roof came first, because water was the enemy that never slept. Outside, the late winter air was sharp and wet, with dirty snow gathered along the platform edges and thin flakes drifting in and out of the gray. Thomas studied the sagging freight room end from the ground. Several shingles had lifted. The wood beneath them had darkened almost black. He remembered Earl's warning about wet boards and did not climb. Instead, he spent 2 cold hours dragging the heavy tarp into place with a long board, rope, and more stubbornness than skill. Twice the tarp slipped. Once it snapped back and struck him across the face hard enough to make his eyes water. Max watched from the platform. "Not helpful," Thomas said. Max only blinked, which somehow felt like judgment. The old well behind the depot offered no comfort. Its rusted hand pump stood half buried in weeds, dead leaves, and crusted snow. Thomas cleared around it, wrapped both hands around the iron handle, and forced it down. The pump groaned like it resented being remembered. On the 4th try, muddy water coughed from the spout, thick with rust and grit. It was not drinkable, but it was water. Thomas found himself grateful for that, which told him how small his world had become, not hopeless, not dry. Sometimes those were different words for the same mercy. For the next several days, the depot taught him humility, one repair at a time. He taped plastic over the cracked window, only to learn the wind could find any loose corner. He cleaned the stovepipe, then discovered soot had a way of returning to a man's hands, no matter how many times he washed them. He tried to brace a weak section of wall near the freight room, measured twice, cut once, and still made the board sit crooked enough to accuse him. By the 3rd attempt, his shoulders burned, and his temper had become a private weather. He set the hammer down before he threw it. Max came over and lowered himself beside the bad board. He did not whine. He did not paw at Thomas. He simply stayed close enough that Thomas could feel his warmth. Thomas sat on an overturned crate. "I have carried men through smoke," he said quietly, "and I cannot make two pieces of pine meet." Max rested his chin on his paws. That was Max's gift. He never tried to explain pain away. He made room for it, then waited until Thomas could stand again. The next morning, Thomas walked to the Harper's Bend Public Library, with the crooked board still bothering him. The library stood beside the closed movie theater, a modest stone building with a blue door and snow piled in gray ridges along the steps. Inside, it smelled of old paper, printer ink, and radiator heat. Behind the desk sat Ellen Mercer, the town librarian. She was in her early 70s, tall and narrow-framed, with soft brown skin, silver hair braided over one shoulder, and square glasses that made her dark eyes seem even steadier. Her long fingers moved over book spines like she was greeting old friends. Ellen had the kind of quiet authority that did not need to raise its voice. Even Max entered softly, as if he knew barking in her kingdom would be poor manners. Ellen looked at Thomas, then at the dog, then at the wet boot marks near the door. "German shepherds may enter," she said, "if they respect the mystery section. He prefers non-fiction." That speaks well of him. Thomas asked for books on roof repair, old floors, stove maintenance, framing, and hand pump wells. Ellen did not ask why until she had placed 5 books and a thick binder of county building guidelines on the table. "You bought Daniel Walker's Depot," she said. "It seems everybody knows before I say it." In a town this small, news has better shoes than people. She sat across from him, her expression gentler now. "Your father used to read the paper here on rainy afternoons, never checked out novels, but once returned a book on Appalachian rail lines with 3 spelling corrections tucked inside. Thomas could almost see him doing it. That sounds like him." "Annoying," Ellen said, "but useful." She disappeared into the local history room and returned with a cardboard archive box. Inside were old timetable copies, a black and white photograph of Harper's Bend Depot in 1949, a map of the former rail corridor, and a thin booklet on timber stations built along the mountain line. "You cannot fix a thing well," Ellen said, "if you do not understand what it was built to be." Thomas spent the afternoon reading under the library's yellow lights, while Max slept beneath the table. Roof diagrams slowly became less mysterious. The county guidelines were dull, but dullness was better than ignorance. For the first time since buying the depot, Thomas felt the work become something other than a wall. It was still too high, but now he could see a few handholds. 2 days later, a man appeared on the depot platform without knocking. He was in his late 60s, lean but solid, with a weathered face, pale blue eyes, and a white beard trimmed close along a square jaw. He wore a faded canvas coat, carpenter's pants, and boots scarred by decades of ladders, mud, and nails. His name was Frank Bell, though he did not offer it until after he had already examined the crooked brace, pressed 2 fingers against a soft floorboard, and made a dissatisfied sound in his throat. "You put that in?" Frank asked. Thomas looked at the brace. "Yes." "You want kind or useful?" "Useful." "It is bad." "I noticed." "Not hopeless. That is different." Frank spoke without cruelty, which made the truth easier to take. He had the manner of a man who had fixed too many storm-damaged porches and too many repairs done by people with more courage than knowledge. "I heard from Ellen," Frank said. "She said Daniel Walker's boy was trying to raise the depot from the dead. I am mostly trying to keep it from falling on me. That comes first in most resurrections." Frank returned the next morning with a hand plane, a square, a thermos of coffee, and no announcement that he intended to help. He showed Thomas how to read the grain, how to set a temporary support without trusting rotten wood, and how to test floorboards by sound before stepping with full weight. He corrected the brace in less than 20 minutes, then made Thomas do the next one himself. "Wood has a memory," Frank said. "Force it wrong, it fights you. Fit it right, it carries more than it should." Thomas looked at the straightened brace and thought of his father, of service, of all the years he had tried to carry weight by force alone. When Frank left, he forgot the hand plane on the bench. Thomas picked it up. "You forgot this." Frank did not turn around. "No, I did not." That evening, rain returned hard and cold. Thomas had patched enough to trust the stove, but not enough to trust the building. Near midnight, Max stood over him and barked once, sharp and low. Thomas woke instantly. Water was running down the wall near the dead electrical panel, following a seam he had not noticed before. The power was disconnected, but the sight still sent a soldier's caution through him. He moved the supplies, wedged plastic above the leak, and marked the wall in pencil for daylight. When it was done, he sat on the floor with his back against the bench, breathing slowly. Max stood beside him until the tension left the room. "You saw it before I did," Thomas said. Max leaned against his knee. There were still hours when the depot felt too large for one man and one dog. There were evenings when cold beans tasted like defeat, when the roof kept dripping after every fix, when the list in the notebook seemed to grow back no matter how many lines he crossed out. But something had changed. The place no longer smelled only of damp. It smelled faintly of sawdust now. The stove gave steadier heat. One window no longer rattled. One brace held straight. One patched board accepted his boot without complaint. On the 7th morning, Thomas stood on the platform with coffee steaming in a chipped mug. Late winter snow drifted lightly over the old rail bed. Max stood at the door, chest lifted, watching the empty line as if guarding a kingdom no map had recognized yet. The depot was not restored. It was not safe. It was not ready for anyone else. But it was less abandoned than it had been. For that morning, that was enough. The first visitor came before Thomas had a sign, a permit, or even enough mugs to pretend he was ready. It was a late winter morning, cold and wet, with rain falling so thin it looked like snow that had lost its courage. Thomas was standing beside the pot-bellied stove, stretching a small spoonful of coffee grounds into one more cup, when Max lifted his head from beneath the bench. A few seconds later, tires spun outside. Thomas opened the door and found a man on the platform, soaked through his navy work jacket, rain dripping from his knit cap. He was in his early 50s, tall and heavy through the middle, with dark skin, tired brown eyes, and a short black beard, salted gray at the chin. Behind him, a white delivery truck sat crooked near the old access road, one rear tire buried in mud. "Does this road still cut back to Route 19?" the man asked, trying to catch his breath. "Not for a long time," Thomas said. The man closed his eyes. "That explains the betrayal." Max stepped beside Thomas, calm but watchful. The man raised one hand. "No trouble, big guy. Just lost, wet, and ready to admit my GPS has ruined my morning." Thomas opened the door wider. "Come in before the cold finishes the job." His name was Raymond Cole, though he said most people called him Ray. He delivered bakery supplies across 3 counties, lived outside Charleston, and had the kind of humor tired people used when anger would cost too much. His hands were large and cracked from years of lifting crates. He kept apologizing for dripping on the floor until Thomas pointed at the stained ceiling. "The roof has already made a stronger argument," Thomas said. Ray looked up, then laughed once, short and grateful. Thomas poured coffee into the least chipped mug. The coffee was thin, but hot enough to matter. "How much?" Ray asked. "Nothing. That is generous. It is weak." Ray took a sip, judged it honestly, and nodded. "Both can be true." Thomas cut the last piece of bread in half and toasted it over the stove. He gave one half to Ray and kept the other on the plate. Ray noticed the pause because hungry men recognize one another without needing the word. "You eaten?" "I will." That is not an answer. Ray broke his half again and placed part of it back on the plate. "Now we can both stop pretending." Thomas wanted to refuse. Pride rose first, as usual. Hunger rose beside it and made a better argument. He accepted the bread. They ate in silence while rain tapped the boarded windows. Max lay near the bench, watching both men. The depot was still damaged, still cold in its corners, still unfit for any official purpose. But that morning it held the weather outside, and holding was enough. Ray looked around the room, the patched window, the books on the ticket counter, the old stove glowing like a stubborn ember in the chest of a tired building. "You fixing it? Trying? For what?" Thomas had answered that question in his head many times, but aloud it felt fragile. A breakfast counter maybe, coffee, soup, simple food, a place for people to sit down when the road is cold. Ray looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at Max. He did not laugh. That was a kindness. Well, he said, the bones are still here. After coffee, Thomas helped him free the truck. He wedged 2 salvaged boards behind the buried tire and pushed while Ray eased backward. Mud climbed Thomas's boots and splashed his pants. Max stood clear of the wheel, barking once when it spun too fast, as if correcting bad machinery. On the 3rd try, the truck lurched free. Ray opened the back and returned with a cardboard crate, 6 day-old rolls, a paper bag of coffee grounds, and a jar of honey with a cracked label. Thomas shook his head. You do not owe me. Then it is not payment. Ray set the crate inside the door. It is evidence I was raised properly. Before leaving, Ray wrote down the roads that still connected and the ones that had quietly surrendered to weeds. At the bottom, he added his number. If I pass this way again, I will bring better coffee, he said. No offense. Some taken? Ray laughed and drove away slowly through the rain. Thomas stood on the platform, looking at the crate by the door. 6 rolls, coffee, honey, small things. Yet the waiting room felt different with them inside, as if the building had received its first guest and survived the effort. By the end of the week, the depot had become a rumor with a chimney, not a business, not a diner, just a place where smoke rose on cold mornings and a veteran with a German shepherd might hand a person a cup of coffee if the kettle had enough in it. 2 county road workers left a few screws and $2. A hiker left an apple. Someone placed a small sack of potatoes beside the door before dawn. None of it solved the roof, but each small thing made the work feel less lonely. Then came Walter Briggs. Walter arrived on a quiet afternoon when the clouds had lifted and the old rail bed shone with melting snow. He was an elderly man with a cane, a wool cap pulled low, and a face carved deep by years underground and years of trying not to speak too much about what he had lost. His shoulders had narrowed with age, but his hands were still large, the nails darkened in a way that made Thomas think of coal seams and hard labor. He stood on the platform for several minutes without knocking, looking down the empty rail line. Thomas stepped outside but did not hurry him. Walter finally said, "My Clara liked trains." Thomas waited. "Not riding them," Walter continued, "just hearing them. Said they made the mountains sound less lonely." The old man's voice stayed steady, but it took work. Thomas held the door open. "Coffee's warm." Walter looked toward him, then toward Max standing inside the doorway. "Dog-friendly? Depends on the person." Walter nodded as if that was the only sensible policy and came in. He sat near the stove with both hands around the mug, his cane resting against his knee. Max watched him for a moment, then crossed the room slowly and rested his head against Walter's leg. The old man's hand lowered to the dog's neck. His fingers trembled once before settling into the fur. "You know, do you?" Walter whispered. Max closed his eyes. Thomas turned slightly away. He had learned that some moments broke if looked at directly. Walter stayed nearly an hour. Before leaving, he took a folded photograph from his coat pocket. It showed the depot decades earlier, maybe in the 1970s, with 2 young people laughing on the platform. "That was Clara," Walter said. "Before the mines took my knees and time took everything else." He tapped the photo once. "You keep it a while. Place ought to remember who loved it." Thomas accepted it carefully. "I will keep it safe." "No," Walter said. "Keep it seen." After Walter left, Thomas placed the photograph on the ticket counter beside Ellen's timetable copies. For the first time, the depot's past did not feel sealed behind dust. It felt like something people might bring back in their hands. That evening, Thomas found an old round tin in the freight room, washed it, dried it near the stove, and set it on the counter. On a piece of cardboard, he wrote, "If you have some, leave some. If you need some, take some." The words were plain, maybe too plain. But plain things had served him better than polished ones. The tin did not fill quickly. It was not that kind of miracle. A folded dollar appeared one morning. Then 3 eggs wrapped in a dish towel, a half-used can of blue paint, a bag of roofing nails, a jar of apple butter, a packet of beef jerky with a note taped to it, "For the dog." Thomas read that note aloud. Max sat straighter than he had all week. None of it fixed the well or made the building legal for business, but the gifts changed the weight of the work. The depot was no longer only Thomas's risk. Other people had begun leaving small pieces of faith there, and faith, he was learning, could be as practical as nails when placed in the right hands. By the second Sunday, Thomas noticed a change in himself. He was tired, but not hollow. His hands hurt from labor. His shoulders ached. His beard smelled of smoke. Yet each morning he woke with something waiting to be done, and that was different from waking with nowhere to go. That morning, late winter snow drifted lightly over the platform while the stove warmed the waiting room. Thomas poured coffee into the kettle, cut bread into 4 thin pieces instead of 2, and set another mug near the counter. He had not opened a diner. He had not passed inspection. He had not hung a sign. But the old depot had begun to receive people again. Not because it was beautiful, it was not. Not because Thomas had enough to give. He did not. They came because a cold road was easier to walk when there was a warm stove at the end of it. They came because Max knew how to greet sorrow without making a scene. They came because Thomas, who had so little left, still knew how to divide a cup, a crust, and a quiet room. Outside, the old rail bed disappeared into gray trees. Inside, the kettle began to tremble. Thomas took down another mug. For several days, Max kept returning to the same corner beneath the old ticket counter. Thomas noticed it the way a tired man notices a dripping faucet, first as background, then as irritation, then as something too steady to ignore. The depot still demanded more than he could give. The roof leaked in 2 places. The well coughed rust before water. The window frame near the bench would not sit square. There were mornings when the building seemed less like a project and more like an argument with weather, time, and money. Max did not argue. He simply returned to that corner. He would step behind the counter, lower his nose to the floorboards near the left support, breathe deeply, circle once, and lie down as if guarding a line no one else could see. He never scratched. He never barked. That made it stranger. If it had been a mouse, Max would have treated the matter as a military campaign. This was different. Quiet, watchful, patient. The ticket booth had become Thomas's thinking place. It was a small square room with a dusty bay window facing the empty rail bed and a narrow stool that complained whenever he sat. Ellen's timetable copies lay on the counter. Walter's photograph of Clara stood beside a chipped mug. The round tin sat near the window with its plain cardboard sign. Some mornings there was nothing inside it. Some mornings there was a folded dollar, 3 coins, or a note written by someone who did not sign their name. None of it fixed the depot. All of it made leaving feel harder. That afternoon, after hours of patching the freight room roof, Thomas came in with wet cuffs, sore shoulders, and cold coffee waiting in the bottom of a mug. The rain had stopped, but the building still dripped in slow afterthoughts. He sat behind the ticket counter, too tired to remove his jacket. Max was already at the corner. "Not now," Thomas said. "If you found another problem, take a number." Max did not move. Then the dog gave a low growl. It was not a loud sound. It did not fill the room or raise the hair on Thomas's neck in fear. It was lower than that, more deliberate, a warning held deep in the chest. Thomas had heard that kind of sound before, in places where the difference between ordinary and wrong could be thin as wire. He set the mug down without drinking. Old habits returned quietly. He did not rush. He let his eyes move first. The boards beneath the counter looked ordinary at a glance. Worn pine, dull with age, dust settled in the seams. But Thomas had spent enough nights with that floor to know its face. This corner did not match. The color was slightly warmer beneath the gray. The grain ran at a different angle. The nail heads were smaller and set deeper than the old square heads around them. Most of all, the edges were too clean. Not fresh, not new, but deliberate. Someone had opened this place once. Someone had closed it carefully. Thomas knelt and ran his fingertips along the seams. One side held a narrow gap packed with old dust. Another pressed tight against the baseboard. He took out his pocket knife, slid the blade into the gap, and felt resistance that was not rot, a fitted edge. From the freight room, he brought a thin strip of metal he had saved from a scrap pile. He worked it slowly under the seam, careful not to splinter the wood. Dust lifted. The board shifted a fraction. Beneath it came a smell the depot had not given him before: oilcloth, trapped air, old paper. Max stood close, silent now. The section did not lift as loose planks. It came up as one hidden panel, joined from underneath by narrow cross pieces. Thomas raised it carefully and set it aside. Beneath was a shallow space between the joists, lined with brown paper and protected better than anything else in the room. Inside lay a dark oilcloth bag wrapped in waxed paper and tied with brittle cord. For a long moment, Thomas only looked at it. He had expected rot, a nest, maybe some forgotten tool. Not this, not something placed by human hands with such care that even the decades seemed to have respected it. He lifted the package out. The cord snapped when he touched it. The waxed paper opened in dry, whispering folds. Inside the oilcloth bag were several paper-wrapped bundles of cash, a stopped pocket watch, a small ledger bound in cracked brown leather, and a group of letters tied with string. Thomas stared at the money first, because any hungry man would. The bills were old but real. 20s, 50s, hundreds. Worn soft at the corners, some still banded with dates written in a careful hand. He counted once too fast, then again slower, $20,000. The number did not feel like joy. It felt like a door, a used truck, a warm room, groceries without counting, medicine without delay, a bed that did not sit under a leaking roof. $20,000 would not make a man rich, but for Thomas, with winter still pressing at the windows and barely more than $200 left, it was enough to change the shape of the next year. Max nudged the ledger with his nose. Thomas looked at him, then opened it. The first page read, Samuel Whitaker, Station Agent, Harper's Bend Depot. The entries began in the late 1940s and continued through the years when the station had faded from necessity into memory. At first, the handwriting looked like accounting, names, amounts, dates, but the notes told a different story. Coal loader, short fare to Charleston. Widow Mason, flour and coffee, no charge. Harlan boys, 3 tickets, pay when able. Family stranded by snow, meal and fire. Truck broke down near crossing, coffee and stove. Beside many entries, Samuel had written one word, forgiven. Not paid, not collected, forgiven. Thomas turned the pages slowly. The word appeared again and again, after small amounts and larger ones, after train fare, meals, coffee, heat, shelter. Samuel had kept account not to shame people, but to remember mercy properly. He had written kindness down like a man balancing the books of a world that often forgot to. The pocket watch lay beside the ledger. It was silver, worn smooth at the edges, its glass cracked across the face. The hands had stopped at 6:17. Thomas wound it gently, but nothing moved. The final letter was dated February 12th, 1978. The envelope was addressed in the same steady hand. To whoever keeps the station after me. Thomas unfolded it. My name is Samuel Whitaker. I was the last station agent at Harper's Bend Depot. I have no children to leave this to, and no wish to see the station become only lumber. This money is what I saved from wages, odd jobs, and a little luck. Some of it I meant to spend on repairs before the railway closed the office for good. Some of it I kept because a man who has watched hard times pass through his door learns that tomorrow often arrives hungry. If you found this, then the floor held longer than I expected, and maybe the station did too. I ask one thing. Do not use this money only to get away. If you must take some to survive, take it. Survival is not a sin, but if there is any strength in you, use the rest to keep this place open in whatever way your time allows. A station was never just for trains. It was for waiting, warming, meeting, leaving, returning, and being called by name before the world forgot you. There are names in my ledger. Some owed me money. Most owed me nothing but the chance to stand upright another day. If their children or grandchildren ever come through here, do not collect. Give them coffee. The coffee always tasted better in this building. I never knew why. Samuel Whitaker Station, Agent Harper's Bend Depot. Thomas read the letter twice. The third time he stopped halfway because the words had already done what they needed to do. He looked at the cash again. $20,000. Enough to leave with dignity. Enough to stay with purpose. That was the cruelty and the mercy of it. If the money had been small, the choice would have been easy. If it had been millions, perhaps it would have felt unreal. But $20,000 was painfully practical. It could rescue him from this room. It could also rescue the room from being forgotten. He thought of Daniel on the platform, teaching him that time was something a person owed. He thought of Ray leaving rolls and coffee by the door. Walter placing Clara's photograph where memory could breathe. The road workers leaving screws and $2. The note that said, "For the dog." He thought of Samuel alone in this booth, writing "forgiven" beside names the world might never speak again. Thomas could take the money and call it mercy, or he could accept that mercy had come with a direction. Max lowered himself beside the open panel and rested one paw near the edge, as if holding the place for him. Thomas let out a slow breath. "I hear you." He did not sleep much that night. He counted the money again, wrapped it back in the oilcloth, and placed it in the old metal cash drawer beneath the counter until he could take it somewhere safer. The ledger, the stopped watch, and Samuel's letter stayed on the counter beside Walter's photograph. Thomas wanted them where he could see them. A man was less likely to lie to himself when the past was looking back. By dawn, light snow had softened the platform steps. Thomas made coffee stronger than usual and stood behind the ticket counter where Samuel must have stood thousands of times, watching the rail bed for arrivals that no longer came. Then he opened his notebook to a clean page and wrote, "Samuel kept this place waiting. I will keep it open." Below it, he began a new list. Roof materials, electrical inspection, well repair, window glass, permit questions, stove safety, food license. The list was longer than before, but it no longer looked like a wall. It looked like a road. Max came to stand beside him. Thomas rested one hand on the dog's head. "We are not leaving," he said. Outside, the old rail bed lay quiet beneath late winter snow. Inside, the ledger of forgiven debts, the stopped watch, and the final letter of the last station agent waited on the counter. Thomas put the brass key in his pocket and stepped toward morning. There was work to do. Thomas did not tell the town about the money, not yet. $20,000 sounded large enough to invite opinions, and Thomas had spent too many years learning that good intentions could become noise when too many people gathered around them. He locked most of the cash away safely in town the next morning, kept Samuel Whitaker's ledger and letter at the depot, and told only one person the whole truth. Ellen Mercer came that afternoon in a dark wool coat, her silver braid tucked over one shoulder, carrying a folder under one arm and a thermos of coffee in the other. She read Samuel's letter behind the ticket counter, while Max slept beneath Walter's photograph. Thomas stood near the stove, unsure whether he was waiting for advice or judgment. When Ellen finished, she did not speak at once. She rested one hand on the ledger as if it were something alive and tired. "My grandmother mentioned Samuel Whitaker," she said at last. "She said he never let a person leave this station colder than they arrived." Thomas looked at the ledger. "I do not know what to do first." Ellen closed the letter gently. "You do the next right thing, then the next one after that." She turned the pages, reading names written decades before. Mason, Doyle, Webb, Briggs, Harlan, train fare, coffee, flour, firewood, a meal during a storm. Beside so many of them stood Samuel's quiet word, "Forgiven." Thomas shook his head before Ellen could say anything else. "I am not collecting from anyone. I know," she said. "That is not why we look." By the end of the week, the library's local history room had become a small map of returned kindness. Ellen used old county directories, church newsletters, cemetery records, and newspaper clippings to follow the names. Thomas helped when he could, though he felt clumsy among the files. Max lay under the table, occasionally receiving a respectful pat from library visitors who seemed to understand that he was part of the research staff. The first name that led somewhere was Harlan. The entry in Samuel's ledger was simple: Harlan boys, 3 tickets, pay when able, forgiven. Ellen found an old notice from 1951 about 2 brothers traveling home when their mother fell ill near Clarksburg. One of those brothers had later opened a small lumber yard. His grandson now owned Harlan Building Supply 20 miles south. Martin Harlan arrived at the depot 2 days later in a flatbed truck. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, with close-cropped gray hair, a square brown face, and a trimmed beard that made him look sterner than he was. He wore a tan work coat, heavy boots, and the careful expression of a businessman who had learned to separate charity from duty. Thomas met him on the platform. "You are Thomas Walker?" Martin asked. "Yes." Ellen Mercer called. Martin unfolded a copy of the ledger page. "She said my grandfather and his brother got home because a station agent here let them ride without money." That is what Samuel wrote. Martin looked past Thomas at the depot, its patched window, scraped platform, and roof still uneven under late winter sky. "My grandfather told that story, not often. He was not a soft man, but he said a man at Harper's Bend put them on a train and handed them coffee wrapped in a towel so it would stay warm." His jaw tightened. "They reached their mother before she died." Thomas let the silence stand. Some stories deserved room. Martin folded the page and put it back in his coat. "My family never knew who to thank. You do not owe me." "No," Martin said. "I do not." He turned toward the flatbed. "But maybe we owe the place." The truck carried boards, shingles, screws, 2 buckets of exterior paint, several lengths of trim, and 3 salvaged window frames. Thomas began to object before Martin had lowered the tailgate. Martin stopped him with one raised hand. "Overstock. This is a lot of overstock. Then I run a badly organized warehouse." "Martin, do not make me call it charity," Martin said. "I came here to return something my grandfather carried for 70 years. Let me do it clean." That ended the argument. Frank Bell arrived the next morning, took one look at the materials stacked beside the freight room, and said, "Good. Now it can be done wrong with better wood." But he had not come alone. With him were 2 retired tradesmen, Eddie Sloan, a wiry black man in his early 70s with silver stubble, narrow shoulders, and eyes that looked amused even when he was criticizing something, and Carl Meacham, a heavier man with white hair, red cheeks, thick glasses, and hands that still moved with the confidence of a plumber who trusted pipes more than promises. Frank pointed with his thumb. "Eddie knows wires, Carl knows water. Neither knows when to stay retired." Eddie looked at the dead electrical panel. "That thing has been waiting to disappoint someone." Carl examined the old pump parts Thomas had cleaned. "And this has been lying to you about being fixed." Thomas accepted both judgments with more gratitude than pride wanted to admit. They did not make the depot safe in a day. They did something more useful. They showed Thomas what safety would require. Eddie labeled the old panel, marked what could not be touched until a licensed inspection, and helped Thomas plan where outlets would eventually need to go. Carl took apart the hand pump, cleaned the pieces worth saving, and made a list of seals and fittings. Frank directed the roof bracing with the calm severity of a man who believed gravity was always listening. Thomas carried boards, held ladders, swept debris, and asked fewer questions than he wanted to. When he did ask, the men answered. No one treated him like a fool for not knowing. That kindness was almost harder to accept than the lumber. By Saturday, Ellen arrived with 4 high school students who needed volunteer hours and had been warned not to touch tools unless told. They scraped loose paint from the platform rail, cleared brush from the fence line, carried broken glass into buckets, and washed the least fragile windows. One tall girl with round glasses asked if the faded sign should be repainted or preserved. Frank stared at her for so long she nearly apologized. "Preserved," he said. "A place should not have to lie about its age." So they cleaned the sign carefully instead of making it new. By afternoon, Harper's Bend Depot could be read from the road without squinting. Thomas should have felt grateful. He did, but gratitude for him came tangled with unease. Every donated board felt like a debt. Every hour of labor felt like a weight added to his name. Poverty had taught him that gifts could become hooks. War had taught him to carry what was his and not slow anyone else down. He knew how to endure help in an emergency. He did not know how to receive it in daylight. Ellen found him behind the freight room, staring at the stacked materials as if they had accused him. "You are about to refuse something again," she said. Thomas rubbed sawdust from his palm. "People are doing too much. People are doing what they can. I should pay them. With what?" He did not answer. Ellen's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "Thomas, some debts are not traps. Some are bridges." Samuel gave people a way across when they needed it. Now their children, or their neighbors, are laying boards back in the other direction. He looked toward the platform. Max moved among the volunteers with his tail low and slow, accepting attention only after inspecting each person's character. A boy offered him a crust of bread. Max took it with the dignity of a town official receiving a sealed document. Ellen followed Thomas's gaze. Do not stand in the doorway and block mercy because you are afraid it will make you smaller. The words landed cleanly. Thomas looked away first. Near noon, Martin opened a cooler and handed out sandwiches. Thomas reached for his own bread inside the depot, but Martin shook his head. Not today. I have food. So do I. That does not mean... Thomas, Martin said, not sharply. My grandfather got home because a man here did not make dignity expensive. Let me feed you a sandwich. Thomas stood there, caught between old pride and new understanding. Then Max sat in front of Martin and stared at the sandwich. Martin looked down. At least one of you understands history. Thomas took the sandwich. It tasted like surrender, but not defeat. There was a difference. By the end of the week, the depot had changed in ways visible from the road. The worst section of roof no longer sagged. Fresh shingles covered the freight room corner. The platform rail had been scraped smooth and primed. The bay window, cleaned of old grime, caught pale winter light. The old sign still looked aged, but now it looked cared for. Inside, order had begun to replace survival. Eddie's pencil notes marked the electrical panel like a doctor's chart. Carl's pump list hung from a nail near the back door. Frank's handplane rested on the bench, as if it had always lived there. Samuel's ledger remained behind the ticket counter, beside Walter's photograph of Clara and the stopped watch set at 6:17. The round tin was still there too, but people had begun leaving things around it. Receipts for discounted materials, phone numbers for inspectors, a church supper schedule, a jar of screws labeled probably useful, and one small knitted scarf meant for Max. Max refused the scarf with absolute dignity. One of the students said, "He looks like a mayor." Eddie said, "He looks like he is preparing legal action." Max sneezed until the scarf was removed. The laughter that followed was small, but it stayed in the rafters. On Sunday evening, after everyone had gone, Thomas stood alone in the waiting room. His back hurt. His hands were split at the knuckles. There were still leaks to chase, permits to understand, money to protect, and repairs that would cost more than hope. But the room felt different now. Not finished, not safe, shared. For most of his life, Thomas had believed strength meant carrying weight without asking who could take the other end. That belief had helped him survive. It had also left him alone long after the danger had passed. Now, in an old depot held together by forgiven debts, borrowed tools, and people who brought what they could, he began to understand what Samuel must have known. Kindness did not move in a straight line. It waited. It wandered. It changed hands. It crossed generations quietly, like a train heard from miles away before it came into view. Thomas opened his notebook beneath the sentence he had written for Samuel and added one more line. Accept help without mistaking it for weakness. Then he closed the book. Outside, late winter dusk settled over Harper's Bend. The old rail bed disappeared into blue shadow. The depot's windows, not whole yet but cleaner than before, held the last light of the day. Max opened one eye from beneath the bench. Thomas looked at him. Yes, he said. They are coming back tomorrow. Max closed his eye again, satisfied. For once, Thomas was too. Richard Hale arrived on a clear morning that made the depot look more valuable than it was. The late winter snow had thinned to pale strips along the rail bed. The cleaned bay window caught the light, and the old sign could finally be read from the road. Harper's Bend Depot still leaned into its age, but now it looked cared for. And cared for things had a way of attracting men who measured value by what could be taken next. Richard stepped out of a black SUV that looked too clean for the access road. He was in his early 60s, tall and narrow, with silver hair combed neatly back, a trimmed gray beard, and a camel-colored overcoat that seemed untouched by weather. His face was handsome in a controlled way, all sharp cheekbones and careful expressions, but his eyes moved like a surveyor's instrument. He saw the platform, the road, the fence line, the open strip of land beyond it, not as memory, but as possibility. Thomas was sweeping near the front door when Richard crossed the platform. Max stood beside the threshold, watching the visitor with polite doubt. "You have done more with it than I expected," Richard said. "You expected less?" "I expected collapse." Richard gave a small, practiced smile. "This is better than collapse. That is almost a compliment. It is an observation." Richard introduced himself as a real estate investor from Charleston. He owned storage parcels, warehouse lots, and small commercial buildings across the region. He explained that he had noticed the depot before Thomas bought it, had considered the access road useful, and still believed the property could serve a practical purpose. "A private storage site," Richard said. "Low traffic, no public liability, no food permits, no emotional burden attached to every board." Thomas leaned the broom against the wall. "You want to buy it? I want to make an offer." The number Richard named was quiet, clean, and dangerous. Thomas did not answer at once. The offer was not a fortune in Richard's world, but in Thomas's it sounded like heat, rent, a used truck, groceries without counting, medicine without delay, and a future that did not require fighting rot one plank at a time. It was enough money to make fear speak in a reasonable voice. Richard noticed the silence and did not press. That was part of his skill. "You have done admirable work," he said, "but old buildings become expensive just when people believe they are saved. Inspection, insurance, electrical code, fire clearance, water testing, food handling, occupancy limits. You already know this." Thomas did know. The county list had arrived 2 days earlier, and it lay behind the ticket counter beside Samuel's ledger. Electrical inspection, safe stove installation, fire extinguisher placement, water testing, hand washing station, food permit, liability insurance, public occupancy notice. A second marked exit if he intended to serve people inside the waiting room. Samuel's money had opened a road, but the road was not flat. Every proper repair had a price. Every legal step had a form. Every form seemed to ask whether Thomas had been foolish to believe a forgotten station could become something useful again. "I am not ready to sell," Thomas said. "That is not the same as no." "No," Thomas admitted. "It is not." Richard handed him a card. "Think about it. Sentiment is easier to preserve when you are not living under it." After he left, Thomas stood behind the counter for a long time, looking at the business card beside the county checklist. Max sat near the old ticket window, silent but attentive. Thomas did not need the dog to speak. The room already held too many arguments. For 3 days, Richard remained polite and persistent. He called once, then again. He returned in person to walk the edge of the access road and study drainage. He never mocked the depot. He never insulted Thomas's dream. He simply made selling sound practical, and practicality could be a cruel temptation when a man was tired. On the 4th evening, the rain came hard from the mountains. It was no longer full winter, but the storm carried winter's temper. Wind hit the windows in flat bursts. Water ran along the access road in muddy ribbons. Thomas had banked the stove and was checking the latch on the back door when Max rose from beneath the bench. The dog went still, then came a low growl, aimed not at the room, but beyond it. Thomas turned. "What is it?" Max moved to the front door and barked once, sharp and final. Thomas grabbed his raincoat and flashlight. The moment he opened the door, wind threw rain into his face. Max bounded onto the platform and ran toward the old access road, stopping only once to make sure Thomas followed. The rail bed was slick under dead leaves. Thomas nearly slipped twice. Ahead, beyond the bend near the leaning fence, Max's bark cut through the storm. Then Thomas saw headlights tilted at the wrong angle. A black SUV had slid half off the road, nose down toward the ditch. A broken sycamore limb lay across the road behind it. One side of the vehicle had sunk into mud. The driver's door was pinned against a bank of wet earth and brush. Water ran beneath the front tires in thin, fast streams. Thomas reached the window and shone the flashlight inside. Richard Hale stared back at him, pale and soaked behind cracked glass. For 1 second, the two men simply looked at each other. Then Richard tried to shift and failed. "Door is jammed," he said, voice tight. "No signal. I thought I could turn around before the road washed out. Thomas tested the driver's door. It did not move. The SUV shifted slightly as mud loosened beneath the front wheel. Stop moving, Thomas said. Keep your hands where I can see them and breathe slow. Richard swallowed. Is it going to slide? Not if we do this right. Thomas ran back to the depot with Max beside him, grabbed the pry bar, a coil of rope, and an old rescue strap Ray had left weeks before after hearing about the road. When he returned, rain had already softened the ditch edge. Max stood near the rear of the SUV, barking whenever mud slipped beneath the tire. Thomas looped the strap around the rear frame and tied it off to the strongest fence post he could trust. It would not pull the SUV out, but it might slow the slide. Then he climbed to the passenger side, planted his boots in the mud, and worked the pry bar into the bent door seam. Richard tried to push from inside. Do not help, Thomas ordered. Stay still. The old command voice came out before he could soften it. Richard obeyed. The door opened by inches. Metal complained. Rain ran down Thomas's neck and into his collar. His hand slipped twice before the latch finally gave. Richard's left leg was pinned awkwardly beneath the lower dash, not crushed, but trapped at a bad angle. Thomas spoke steadily. When I pull, turn your hips, not your knee. I understand. No, you heard me. Understand after. Pain almost made Richard laugh and almost stopped him breathing. Max barked twice. The SUV shifted again. Thomas reached in, braced his foot against the frame, and pulled. Richard came free with a sharp sound he tried to bury. Thomas dragged him through the passenger side and half-carried him up the ditch. Behind them, the front wheels sank deeper, and the SUV leaned hard enough for the side mirror to crack against a stump. They reached the depot slowly. Richard's overcoat was torn, his polished shoes ruined, his hair plastered to his head. Without the careful surface, he looked older, not weaker exactly, but human in a way Thomas had not seen before. Inside, Thomas wrapped him in a dry blanket, fed the stove, and set coffee to heat. Max stood close enough to drip on Richard's expensive trousers, watching him like a judge who had postponed sentencing. Richard held the mug with both hands. They trembled slightly. You knew it was me, he said after a while, after I saw the car. And you still came. You were in trouble. Richard looked into the fire. No answer rose quickly enough to protect him. Rain beat against the roof. Somewhere near the back wall, water dripped into a bucket with steady patience. I came back to study the access road, Richard said. Drainage, entry angle, whether a storage plan would need grading. He gave a breath that had no humor in it. Efficient, wasn't I? Thomas did not say what he could have said. Silence did the work better. Richard looked around the waiting room. The patched window, the clean sign visible through the rain, the tin on the counter, Walter's photograph, Samuel's ledger resting beneath the stopped watch, Max lying at Thomas's feet. What is that ledger? Richard asked. Thomas hesitated, then told him enough. Not the full amount of money, not every private detail, but Samuel, the station agent. The debts marked forgiven. The letter asking whoever found it to keep the place open if they had the strength. The idea that a station was never only for trains, but for waiting, warming, leaving, returning, and being called by name before the world forgot you. Richard listened without interrupting. By the time Thomas finished, the storm had softened to a hard whisper. Richard stared at the tin. If you have some, leave some. If you need some, take some. That is the idea. I thought this place was sentiment. It is, Thomas said. But not only that. Richard looked at him then, and for the first time since they had met, he did not seem to be calculating. By morning, the rain had moved east. The old road was gouged with mud, and Richard's SUV sat wounded near the ditch until Martha sent a tow truck from town. Richard's ankle was swollen but usable. His coat was beyond saving. His pride, Thomas suspected, had taken the worst hit. Before leaving, Richard stood on the platform and looked at the depot for a long time. I am withdrawing the offer, he said. Thomas studied him. Because I pulled you out? No. Richard looked toward the access road, then back at the building. Because last night I finally understood what I was trying to buy. Max sat between them, tail around his paws. Richard glanced down. And because your partner would clearly object. He has standards. Apparently better than mine. Richard came back 4 days later in a borrowed pickup, not the black SUV. Mud still marked the tires. He brought a licensed electrician named Graham Pike, a compact man in his 40s with close-cut blonde hair, a neat beard, and the calm, exact manner of someone who trusted measurements more than promises. With him was Lyle Borden, a retired fire marshal in his late 60s, broad-bellied and bald, with dark eyebrows, a gravelly voice, and a habit of noticing exits before greeting anyone. Richard also brought a folder filled with rural rehabilitation grants, code notes, permit contacts, and a checklist written in plain English. He did not offer to take over. He did not write a dramatic check. He stood in the waiting room with the folder under one arm and spoke carefully. "I know inspectors," Richard said. "I know paperwork. I know which rules are flexible and which rules will shut a door forever. If you allow it, I can help get this place ready the right way." Thomas looked at him. "I cannot owe you the depot. You will not. I cannot have you buying decisions. I am not asking to." "Then what are you asking?" Richard looked toward the ticket counter, where Samuel's ledger lay closed beneath the stopped watch. "To leave something," he said, "without making it mine." Thomas understood that better than he expected. They shook hands on the platform beneath a gray sky still damp from the storm. The boards were wet under their boots. The depot stood behind them, scarred, stubborn, and alive enough to have changed one more man. At the last second, Max pushed his head between their hands and forced both men to adjust. Richard looked down. "Does he supervise every agreement?" "Only the important ones." This time, Richard laughed without polishing it first. The depot did not open with a ribbon cutting. There was no mayor with polished shoes, no photographer from a city paper, no speech long enough to make the soup go cold. It opened on a pale morning in early spring, when the last dirty snow had pulled back into the shadows. The rail bed smelled of thawing earth, and the windows of Harper's Bend Depot glowed with warm light before sunrise for the first time in years. Thomas unlocked the front door at 5:30. For a moment, he stood with his hand on the brass key and listened. The room sounded different now, not new, never that. The floor still creaked in familiar places. The old walls still shifted when the wind came down the rail bed. The pot-bellied stove still gave a stubborn click when it warmed. But beneath those sounds was something steadier, the hum of a small refrigerator, the soft buzz of inspected wiring, the simmer of soup in a steel pot, the low breath of a building no longer holding itself closed. The sign over the counter read, "The Old Depot Table." Ellen had painted the letters by hand on a piece of reclaimed wood, careful and plain, because Thomas had refused anything that looked too polished. Frank had mounted it slightly crooked, then claimed the wall was crooked first. Richard had paid for the food service inspection fee through what he called a paperwork sponsorship, which fooled no one but allowed Thomas to accept it without too much argument. Graham Pike had brought the lights up to code. Lyle Borden had checked the stove clearance, the extinguishers, the exit signs, and the emergency path 3 times before declaring that the old building was less dangerous than some churches I have inspected. It was not a restaurant in the way glossy magazines use the word. It was a small breakfast counter in an old waiting room. Coffee, hot soup, bread, eggs, oatmeal, biscuits when someone had time to bake, and whatever honest food could be made without pretending to be fancy. The menu was written on a chalkboard beside the ticket window. Coffee, soup, eggs and bread, oatmeal, pay what you can, sit as long as you need. Thomas had stared at that last line for a long time before writing it. The walls carried the story without shouting. A framed photograph of Daniel stood near the stove, younger than Thomas was now, lean, sharp-boned, with his work cap tilted back and one hand resting on a platform rail. Beneath it hung a copied page from Samuel Whitaker's ledger, the word forgiven clear beneath a list of old names. The stopped silver pocket watch rested in a small shadow box, its cracked glass catching the morning light. Walter's photograph of Clara remained on the ticket counter, not hidden away, because Walter had been right. Some memories needed to be kept seen. The old depot sign had been cleaned, not repainted. Its faded letters still carried weather and age. Thomas liked it that way. A thing could be restored without being made to lie about what it had survived. Max took his post beside the door. He had received a proper bed from someone in town, a thick cushion covered in brown canvas, but he used it only when no one was watching. On opening morning, he lay on the wooden floor with his front paws crossed, his black saddle coat brushed, his amber eyes alert, and his torn ear tilted toward the road. He looked less like a pet than the quiet keeper of the threshold. Anyone who entered would have to pass his judgment first, which mostly involved being sniffed, studied, and forgiven. The first person through the door was Ray Cole. He arrived with a crate of rolls under one arm and a paper bag of coffee grounds in the other. His delivery truck was parked safely on the road this time, nowhere near the mud. "I brought coffee strong enough to apologize for the first batch," Ray said. Thomas took the bag. "That is a high standard. I have been living with shame." Max stood, accepted a scratch from Ray, then inspected the crate of rolls with professional seriousness. "These are for customers," Ray told him. Max looked unconvinced. The second person was Walter Briggs, moving carefully with his cane, wool cap pulled low, though the morning was not as cold as it had been. He paused near Clara's photograph and rested 2 fingers against the edge of the frame. "She would have liked the light," he said. Thomas set a mug in front of him. "Coffee?" Walter nodded. "And whatever Max recommends." Max recommends everything with meat. Wise dog. By 6:30, the room had begun to fill in the gentle, uneven way of a place people were still learning how to trust. 2 road workers sat near the window with bowls of soup. A retired school secretary paid for oatmeal with exact change and left an extra $1 beneath her spoon. Martin Harlan came in with his son Jonah and pretended he had only stopped to inspect the trim. Frank arrived with Eddie and Carl, and all 3 immediately began criticizing the height of the coat hooks, the placement of the napkins, and each other's ability to sit quietly. Ellen took the table near the history wall and watched everything with the satisfaction of a woman who had known all along that paper records could still grow roots. Richard Hale came later than the others. He wore a plain dark jacket this time, not the camel overcoat, and walked with a slight stiffness in the ankle he refused to mention. He stood just inside the door for a moment, as if waiting to be told whether he belonged. Max rose and approached him. The room went quiet enough for Thomas to notice. Richard looked down. "Good morning." Max sniffed his hand, considered the matter, then leaned his head briefly against Richard's knee. The room resumed breathing. Thomas poured coffee and set it on the counter. "He has cleared you for public use." Richard picked up the mug. "That is a relief. I had concerns about permitting." That made Ellen laugh from her table. The morning did not run smoothly. The first pot of oatmeal scorched because Thomas forgot it while helping Walter with his chair. A man asked for toast, and Thomas discovered the toaster had given up on service before the depot officially began. The sink drained slowly until Carl stood up, sighed like a disappointed prophet, and fixed the trap with a butter knife and a look of personal betrayal. Someone tracked mud across the cleaned floor. Someone else cried quietly into coffee, and then apologized for it, as if tears required permission. Thomas told her, "Coffee comes with room for that." She was a woman in her late 40s named Janet Moore, a hospice nurse from the next town, with tired green eyes, pale skin, and dark blonde hair pulled into a loose braid. She had stopped it after a night shift because she had seen the lights from the road and thought, for one second, that the old depot looked like someone had waited up for her. She did not tell Thomas much more than that. She did not need to. Max sat beside her chair until her hand found his fur. By mid-morning, the tin on the counter had changed too. It was the same round tin Thomas had found in the freight room, cleaned and dented and honest, but the cardboard sign had been replaced with a small wooden card Martin had made from scrap trim. "Who can you help today?" Thomas had worried the words were too bold. Ellen said they were not a command, only a question. Questions left room for a person to answer in their own way. Some people paid full price, some paid extra, some paid nothing, and kept their eyes low when they realized Thomas would not announce it to the room. One man left a $10 bill for 2 coffees. A woman left 3 jars of peach preserves. Ray wrote an unpaid tab for himself as a joke, then paid it twice. Walter put a coin in the tin every time Max looked away, claiming the dog did not understand fixed-income finances. The strange thing was that the counter never had enough to make Thomas comfortable, but it always had enough to make the next pot. Near noon, when the rush thinned, Thomas stood behind the counter with a towel over one shoulder and smoke in his beard. His hands hurt. His feet hurt. His heart, oddly, did not. For years, he had believed survival was the only work left to him. Wake up, keep moving, do not break where anyone can see. But here, in a room built for waiting, he had become useful in small, measurable ways. Coffee poured, soup served, a chair pulled out, a name remembered, a door opened. No metal had ever felt like that. Martha Willis came in just after noon with a clipboard she did not need, and the expression of a woman trying very hard not to appear moved. She looked around at the filled mugs, the posted permit, the clean exit path, the fire extinguisher mounted exactly where Lyle had demanded it, and Max asleep halfway in a sunbeam. "You passed," she said. "I know. I mean more than inspection." Thomas looked down at the counter. Martha softened. Daniel would have complained about the coffee being too expensive. It is pay what you can. Then he would have complained on principle. Thomas smiled. It came easier than it used to. Ellen raised her mug. "To the station." Frank grumbled. "Do not start a speech." Eddie raised his mug anyway. Ray did too. Walter lifted his slowly. Richard, after a pause, followed. Thomas looked around the room, at Daniel's photograph, Samuel's ledger, Clara's image, the cleaned windows, the old sign, the people sitting beneath a roof that had almost been lost. He did not feel like a hero. That word belonged to stories other people needed to tell. He felt like a man who had kept a stove lit long enough for others to find the door. Max opened one eye as if checking that everyone understood who had truly managed the operation. Thomas leaned down and scratched behind his torn ear. "Yes," he murmured. "You too." By late afternoon, the last bowl had been washed, the floor swept, and the chairs pushed in. The depot settled into a peaceful quiet, tired but not empty. Outside, early spring light lay across the rail bed. The old tracks were gone, but the path remained, cutting through the trees toward places no one could see from the platform. Thomas turned the sign on the door from "Open to Back Tomorrow." He stood for a moment beside the counter, reading the wooden card again. "Who can you help today?" Then he looked at Max, asleep at the door, and at the room that had once been no more than a cold shelter and a risk he could barely afford. It was still humble, still imperfect, still one hard season away from another repair list, but it was open. And so was he. 1 year later, Harper's Bend Depot no longer looked like a place waiting to be erased. Early spring had returned to the West Virginia mountains, softening the ditches with new grass and leaving only pale traces of old snow in the shaded cuts along the rail bed. The roof still complained in hard rain. The floor still creaked in the same stubborn places. But every morning before sunrise, warm light filled the old windows, and people in the valley knew there would be coffee inside. No train had returned. The rails were still gone. The old line still vanished into trees, weeds, and memory. No conductor called from the platform. No whistle rolled down the valley at dawn. Yet the station was not empty anymore. Road workers came before daylight. Truck drivers found it by word of mouth. Retired miners sat near the stove. Nurses stopped after night shifts. Veterans came in quietly, sometimes saying little more than coffee. And Thomas learned to hear all the things hidden inside that one word. The old depot table never became rich. It became reliable. That mattered more. The menu stayed simple: coffee, soup, eggs, bread, oatmeal, biscuits when someone baked them, pie when Ray brought too much fruit and claimed it was an emergency. The round tin still sat on the counter beneath the wooden card Martin had made. "Who can you help today?" Some days people answered with money. Some days, eggs, apples, a repaired hinge, a ride home, or a silence generous enough not to ask another person why their hands were shaking. Thomas had changed in ways strangers might not notice. He was still broad-shouldered and watchful, still careful with windows and doors, still quiet when rooms grew too loud. But his quiet no longer felt like hiding. His beard had more silver in it now. The lines around his eyes had deepened, not only from sorrow, but from mornings spent laughing at Ray's terrible jokes, Frank's insults, and Max's firm belief that every dropped biscuit was a matter of natural justice. He still missed his father. That had not ended. Thomas no longer expected it to. Grief, he had learned, was not a door a person walked through once. It was a room one learned to furnish differently. Daniel was still gone, but he was no longer only absence. He was the photograph near the stove. He was the Saturday memory on the platform. He was the repaired step, the packed sandwich, the lesson that time was something a person owed. Thomas could not go back and become the son he wished he had been, but he could care for what his father had loved. That was not the same as erasing regret. It was better. It was putting regret to work. Max, now 8, had become the soul of the depot without ever applying for the position. His hips were slower, his muzzle whiter, and his torn ear more famous than any sign in town. He lay beside the door like a judge, a mayor, and a tired old soldier all at once. He was gentle with the elderly, suspicious of loud men, patient with veterans, and especially tender with anyone who entered as if they were not sure they were allowed to stay. On the first anniversary of opening day, Ellen organized what she called a small gathering, which proved that librarians could be trusted with history, but not with the size of guest lists. By noon, the depot was full of coffee, soup, biscuits, old stories, and people pretending they had not come for anything sentimental. Ellen stood near the counter in a dark blue dress and gray cardigan, her silver braid over one shoulder, square glasses low on her nose. At 73, she still carried the quiet authority of someone who could silence a room by turning a page. Frank stood near the stove with his hands in his pockets, looking prepared to disapprove of any emotion that might damage the floorboards. Walter sat beneath Clara's photograph. Ray leaned against the wall with a basket of rolls. Richard stood near the side window, not in front, not important, simply present. He had changed too. Richard Hale still looked like a man who understood contracts, but he no longer looked as if everything in the world needed to become one. He wore a plain dark jacket now, his silver hair combed back, his beard neat, his posture less sharp than it had been a year earlier. Max crossed the room once, leaned against Richard's leg, and accepted a slow scratch behind the ear. Richard lowered his head as if receiving an honor. Ellen tapped a spoon against a mug. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "You said no speeches?" "I said no long speeches," Ellen replied. Frank muttered, "All speeches are long." Ellen ignored him. 1 year ago, this depot opened its doors again. Before that, it was considered unsafe, impractical, and not worth saving. She looked around the room. It took stubbornness, tools, permits, old records, soup, younger backs, older knees, and one dog with better judgment than most town committees. At that exact moment, Max sneezed. The room broke open with laughter. The sneeze saved everyone from becoming too solemn, including Thomas. He laughed before he could guard himself. Max looked around, dignified and mildly offended, as if the room had misunderstood an official statement. Ellen uncovered a small wooden plaque on the counter. Thomas stiffened. "Ellen, it is not money. That does not make it harmless. Read it." The plaque was made from reclaimed oak, sanded smooth but left with its grain and weather marks. The lettering had been burned by hand. Harper's Bend Depot. Brought back by a soldier, a dog, and the kindness of a town. Thomas stared at it. For a moment the words blurred. He wanted to say Samuel had started it. Daniel had led him back to it. Ellen had found the names. Frank had kept the roof honest. Martin had brought wood. Richard had opened doors no permit form wanted to open. Ray, Walter, Janet, Martha, Eddie, Carl, and half the town had carried some piece of the place back into the light. He wanted to say Max deserved his name first. Instead, his throat closed around all of it. Max sneezed again. Ray said, "He objects to billing order." Laughter rose a second time, softer now. Thomas put one hand on the plaque and the other on Max's head. "Thank you," he said. It was not enough, but it was true. Sometimes true was enough. Later, when the room had returned to food and conversation, Thomas saw Richard standing beside the tin. Richard did not look around to see whether anyone noticed. He simply slipped a small envelope inside. On the front, In careful block letters were the words, "For the next person who needs a warm meal." Thomas saw it. Richard saw that he saw it. Neither man spoke. Some gratitude was deepest when left unannounced. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned. Walter touched Clara's photograph before leaving. Ellen wrapped leftover biscuits in a towel and pretended they were for inventory control. Frank mounted the plaque near the history wall, checked it with a level twice, and declared the wall acceptable by accident. Ray promised to bring more coffee next week and threatened to campaign for pie as a permanent menu item. Richard left quietly, pausing only to nod at Thomas from the platform. When the depot finally grew still, Thomas carried a mug outside and sat on the bench along the platform. The air had cooled, but spring was in it. The old rail bed stretched into the trees, silver gray under the evening sky. No rails, no train, no schedule, only the path, still there after everything else had been taken. Max came out slowly, circled once, and rested his head against Thomas's knee. Thomas laid a hand over the dog's worn ear. For a long time, he listened to the wind moving down the empty line. A year ago, that sound had felt like loss, like distance, like every goodbye he had not answered in time. Tonight, it sounded different. It moved through the sycamores and along the platform boards, carrying wood smoke, coffee, thawed earth, and rain far off in the mountains. It sounded almost like a train whistle, heard from very far away, not calling him to leave, calling to say he had finally arrived. Thomas looked at the glowing windows behind him. Inside were Daniel's photograph, Samuel's ledger, Clara's memory, Richard's envelope, the town's plaque, and 100 small traces of people who had needed warmth and found it. Then he looked down at Max. "We made it home," he said. Max closed his eyes against Thomas's leg, as if he had known that all along. And the old depot, which had waited through silence, weather, and years of being forgotten, kept its light burning into the evening, not for trains, for whoever was still on the road. Sometimes God does not send a miracle with thunder or bright light. Sometimes he sends it quietly, through a loyal dog who refuses to walk away, an old door that opens at the right moment, a stranger who leaves a little more than he takes, or a tired heart that somehow finds the strength to begin again. Thomas thought he was rebuilding a forgotten depot, but perhaps in God's quiet way, the depot was rebuilding him too. Every cup of coffee, every shared meal, every hand that came to help became a reminder that no life is too broken to be used for something good. Maybe in our own daily lives, we are also passing by small miracles without noticing them. A kind word, a warm meal, a prayer whispered for someone who will never know our name. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a little hope today.
Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories about restoration and faith. And wherever you are, may God bless your home, guide your step, and bring life back into the place that once feel forgotten.